Hello, everybody. I'm John Atack, as usual, and I am delighted to welcome Jen Senko. And I can't remember when it was I first watched the Brainwashing of My Dad, but I was really impressed. And so over the weekend, I watched it again, and I was even more impressed. So just a brilliant documentary, and I thoroughly recommend it to all and sundry. So,
thank you. Thanks.
Would you like to tell the people a little bit about the documentary and what brought it about, and your lovely father, who, what a remarkable man.
Yeah, I kind of had to make this documentary if it was the last thing that I did on Earth, and it almost was. I got pneumonia, I got shingles. It took a toll on my health, but I'm glad I did it.
Oh.
So shortly after my dad retired, he partly retired. He got a part-time job, like 3 days a week, but it had a long commute. So he found talk radio because he always wanted to educate himself. But it was Bob Grant. So, Bob Grant, I don't know if you know, he's in America, he's the godfather of conservative combat radio. And he was openly sexist and openly racist. He said some horrible things. Anyway, when my dad fully retired, like a year or two later, it was probably the end of the 80s, he found Rush Limbaugh. Now, Reagan had kind of destroyed the Fairness Doctrine in 87, and just a year later, Rush Limbaugh went national, wreaking havoc.
And maybe for our non-US audience, you could tell us what the Fairness Doctrine was before it was destroyed by Reagan.
Oh, okay. The Fairness Doctrine was a genius enactment by FDR to create diversity in radio ownership. I mean, radio, and there wasn't TV back then, but anything to do with broadcast. Basically, he didn't want a conglomeration, just like one or two people owning it and dominating the media. So it was supposed to be fairness and diversity of ownership. So when Reagan destroyed that, it was pretty harmful. And then Rush Limbaugh was like one of the casualties. I mean, he was, So my dad, having been addicted, so because he was vulnerable, I mean, we can get into the whys and the hows later, which after reading your book, I was just really, it just even fed my mind more. I was really excited. I think your book is brilliant.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for making me read it. It was like a homework assignment. Anyway, he was in transition. He had this whole new life. So he filled his time partly with Rush Limbaugh, listening to him for 3 hours a day, and his personality radically changed. So did all his beliefs. Previous to that, he had been a open-minded, almost like hippie prototype person, embarrassing my mother because he'd be like, who cares? Just do it as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. And he turned into and he was always whistling and happy and talking to strangers with accents because he could speak about 7 different languages.
Oh, wow.
And but after he started listening to Rush Limbaugh, he became really anti-immigrant, really, really angry, very argumentative. It was interesting. It was like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like there's my dad in his body, but what happened to him? And if I came down from New York to visit them, he'd pick me up in his car. I called it like a crap mobile. It had stickers all over it, against Clinton, and but he'd have Rush Limbaugh blasting on that, So anyway, it was really quite traumatizing for our whole family to see how he changed.
Mm.
Um, and around that time, I started getting interested in politics, and I liked Clinton. I didn't like Reagan.
Mm.
I mean, looking back, I see how Clinton was, center right and did a terrible thing with the Telecommunications Act in 1996.
Mm.
It's terrible. Um, but um, my dad hated Clinton, and he also, then when email came in, he started sending us all of these emails, and I started seeing a pattern. And the emails were basically differently worded things of what Rush Limbaugh was saying,
Mm.
and and they were always, the main thing was uh, demonizing Democrats,
Mm.
like under any kind of umbrella, whether it was um, African Americans or poor people, whatever, anything that Democrats stood for, that
Mm.
was against that. He hated Democrats, and we were all middle of the road Democrats. Um, so it was quite a nightmare. And I thought, I had done a couple documentaries, and I thought, in addition to it being horrifying, it was interesting, like sociologically,
Mm.
to see this transformation that my father went through.
Yeah.
Like, how could this happen? I never would have imagined it. And how could he be this influence, and also what's going on
Mm.
with all of this poison and this hatred, and it was so obvious to me there was some connection between all of these things, the email, and then the snail mail he got, and the radio, and so yeah, I thought back then I want to do a documentary about this. But so part of the documentary was, a good part of it was, discovering that there was a plan. There was a vast right wing conspiracy.
Mhm.
And now I can say it, kind of plainly out in the open. You know, Hillary had the balls to say it back, and was it 87, 90, 97, 98, something like that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Some
Um,
time ago, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And was, sharply criticized for it. But that um, that basically libertarian Republicans and oligarchs saw the country changing. Especially after Brown v. Board of Education, that's when it started. They didn't like what FDR did, and they just finally started planning. And this was part of a really brilliant, comprehensive plan to turn the country to the right.
Mm.
So I looked at things like um, Roger Ailes and his influence over Nixon, and his design when he was working in the Nixon White House, and even designing how the Christmas tree should look, like every aspect, was all PR. Um, and he made Nixon try and sound like a little warmer and fuzzier, you
Mm.
know.
Good luck with
That
that.
yeah, exactly. He did train him well in the art of the soundbite.
Mm.
But anyway, he wrote this, or this, we don't know if he wrote it or not, but this memo he was handing around the White House, it had to do with how to get the GOP news on television. It wasn't so much about reporting GOP news, Republican news. It was about converting people to vote Republican.
Yeah.
So that was something, if you think like, okay, that was intent, and then, in '96, uh, Rupert Murdoch hires him to construct Fox News. And then there was Reagan and the Fairness Doctrine. Oh, and the Lewis Powell memo. I don't want to be boring and go into too much detail, but which I could go into a lot of detail. But anyway, there are all these things along the way. Clinton and the Telecommunications Act, which basically opened up anybody. It was a free for all. Anybody could buy as much media as they wanted, and that was a big get for the right. Yeah. So, but then anyway, I go into a lot of this, and then years later, I wrote the book because I was so fascinated with it. I did even more research and read some great books like Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains, and um, um, The Shadow Network by Ann Nelson, and just other books which like really filled it all out to me. It was very apparent there was this really humongous plan. But the good news is, at the end of the movie, there's a little surprise. There's a very good ending. I
Spoiler
would love,
alert.
yes, spoiler alert. But I think for the purpose of our discussion and who you are and what you talk about, I'm going to tell it. So my parents moved to a senior community. This was in the 2000s. And in the move, my dad's radio broke somehow. I don't know how, but it broke, and it ended up in the garage.
Mm.
And gee, he couldn't listen to the radio at lunchtime. So he and my mom started eating lunch together again, or he would just watch what she had on the television.
Mm.
So immediately, without Rush Limbaugh, I don't know, he's softened. He just became more tolerable. And that was a very interesting thing,
Mm.
less argumentative. So I started visiting a lot more. And this is when I started making the film, because I
Mm.
thought, oh, I can approach him without him getting too angry. Like instead of angry like a tornado, he'd be like just a little angry. So then the television in the kitchen conked out, like the old people, there's old television, old radios. And my mother loved programming remotes. And she programmed the remotes, right? And she had stickies all over them. And my dad just didn't want to deal with it. So he watched what she watched. Okay. So then he's even more mellow. And he's not arguing politics anymore, but he's still getting the emails. So once in a while, he'll still send zingers to the whole family, and everybody's like, oh, Dad, please stop it. We're going to block you, blah, blah, blah. But one day, he had to go into the hospital for a kidney stone, and he was there for a week. And they had these old clunky computers. And my mom said, Jennifer, why don't you kill some of Daddy's emails because they're going to clog up the computer?
Mm.
And I started to do it. And then I said, Mom, they just keep coming. So she got the idea of unsubscribing him from a lot of these radical right wing emails. And then got the idea of subscribing him to some more liberal and progressive ones like Truth Out, Alternate, Reader Supported News. And they just kind of mixed in. And when he came home, he just read everything. And his personality changed back. And it was like a miracle because these were the last years of his life, the last few years of his life. And he was happy, he was singing, he was whistling. And the most interesting thing is one day he said to my mom, I like that guy Obama. And she called me up on the phone and told me he said that. I said, no, I don't believe that. And anyway, we celebrated his birthday on Halloween, and that was when his birthday was. And she brought it up again, I think, to show me. And she said, so who are you going to vote for? And he said, Obama. And, it was a real complete story.
Mm,
It had several layers,
mm,
with the conspiracy going on, and, my dad's story and his transition and
mm.
change and his change back, and so, yeah, that's the spoiler alert.
Yeah. And everybody, you still have to watch it because it's absolutely packed with fascinating detail. And I mean, I came away from it with a real affection for both of your parents, for your mum's tolerance of all of this, and the cleverness that went into resolving it. And quite evidently, your father was a wonderful man. There's a point where you talk about him giving money to a beggar and calling the beggar sir, showing respect to the beggar. And
Yeah,
to be transformed from that into spewing forth hate on so many topics.
yeah,
And I think for me, the important takeaway is your dad, as you prove in the documentary, is by no means an isolated case. You reached out and you found lots of people who'd had a similar experience, people whose parents, wouldn't talk to them anymore because they voted for Obama, or and it puts us into a situation. I think we need to be very alert to this. That um, as a kid, there were two things that confused me. As a teenager, there were two things that really confused me. The first was, how could Jack the Ripper have done what he did? The most famous of serial killers, but the mutilation, all of this horrible stuff. How could a human being do that to somebody else? That made no sense to me. And the other was, how could a man like Adolf Hitler have influenced the entire German speaking world so profoundly that they were willing to not only turn a blind eye to atrocities, but commit atrocities? And there's a misquotation from Voltaire, which is people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. He didn't quite say that.
mm,
But thankfully, the second Prime Minister of India, Radhakrishnan, did say it. And
mhm,
I think it's a very important point. And it takes us to, how do we come to believe? And we have all of these ideas of brainwashing, mind control, coercive control, exploitative persuasion, and they're all relevant, but they're amplifications of normal processes. And if somebody controls your information, they control you. When Edward Bernays, who is very much at the beginning of much of this, when he first heard of what Goebbels was saying in Germany on the radio, he said, he's read my book.
mm.
And the book is called Propaganda.
Do you
Um,
think do you
and
think did read his book?
I'm pretty sure that because there was so little literature at the time,
Mm,
that whatever, I suppose the other pundit was Ivy Lee, but he didn't write a book. So and of course there was a tremendous influence from Mussolini and the Italians, who were also working in similar ways. But um, Bernays is the star of this field in the 1920s. That he has no competition. A double nephew of Sigmund Freud, who had contacted Freud and said, "How can I manipulate people?" And he basically says, "Look, of course we need democracy, but people aren't educated enough yet. So for the meantime, we need to sell them sex so that they'll do what we clever people think they ought to do. And then one day they'll be educated enough." Now, that was 100 years ago.
they're less
And
educated
I'm
now.
pretty sure that we're still not educated enough as far as he'd be concerned, because you have
Mm,
to agree with such a person to go along. And what we've seen more and more is, in society around the world, but particularly in the US as an outsider, this division and this divisiveness that so many politicians, I mean, Barack Obama tried to create a non-partisan government, but it doesn't seem possible in the United States anymore. Um, I was very surprised. I became fascinated by Donald Trump as soon as he, excuse me, as soon as he announced his candidacy. I started watching everything I could about Donald Trump. He was just this unbelievable character. It was as if Disney had sort of created him somehow. This man whose name, well, it means fart, Trumpf. So it was sort of, is this real? Is this true? And so much of what was said about him was being said by his friends.
Was what?
It was being, his friends were saying, this is the way he behaves. They weren't opponents to him. Mm-hmm. And it was as if we'd sort of crossed a line. Let me also say that I too, in retrospect, I am not a big fan of Bill Clinton. Extraordinary rendition, torture sites, this kind of stuff, war crimes, stopping welfare, first time a president had intervened. But there is this point where it becomes, as George W. Bush said over the invasion of Afghanistan, you're either with us or against us. There's no room for any shades of belief. You're this or you're that. You're the opponent or the Satan, to use the biblical term for an opponent, or you are with we godly good people. And at that point, my heart sinks. Now, during the Clinton campaign, a man called Philip Gould travelled over from the UK and was on the campaign and watched everything that was done. And he took the campaign methods and brought them to New Labour under Tony Blair. And Tony Blair won his election in 1997 by using techniques that had been refined during the Clinton campaign. So let me sort of say, I don't trust either side in this division. I think that what's happened is, so we had lots of spin doctors. We had Alistair Campbell, Derek Draper, Philip Gould, and they wrote books about how they'd conned us, as if they were boasting about how they'd managed to get us to vote for their politicians. And I started going, I would like to see consensus politics. I would like to see a point where we think about things and talk about things, where we put down the megaphones and stop swearing at each other and come to conclusions that are helpful for all of us. And we are seeing it split further and further apart. And then comes QAnon. And this place where there doesn't seem to be any reality left anymore. There's just spin. There are just these surreal tales that are being told about other people. And it gets ever more confusing because, of course, we then have Fancy Bear and APT-10, APT-28, the Chinese and Russian agencies. And we know that there's a policy within Russia that comes from Alexander Dugin, one of Putin's supporters, of divide and conquer. And so you give money to the nutcases. Alexander Dugin is one of those nutcases. He founded the National Bolshevik Party, which takes all of the best elements of National Socialism and Stalinism and brings them together. I'm not aware of any good elements in those teachings. And at first, he's funded by Putin because if you fund the crazies, by contrast, you'll look sensible. Then Dugin becomes an advisor to Putin. And we have this whole idea of neo-traditionalism in Russia where, Dugin is very confusing, but eventually after reading about 100 pages of his philosophy, I realized that what he wants to do is to return us to the Middle Ages, that we need serfs again. And neo-traditionalism will be a return to this where the church will rule everything. And of course, the Russian Orthodox Church is now completely separate from all of the other Orthodox churches. They've all denounced Basil the Patriarch. But so we have this idea of an oligarchy, of a plutocracy, of a small group ruling elite. And they're willing to tell any lie at all. So we now have this, I do seek to talk with people who believe these ideas and try and understand how they've come to them. And as I say, I'm non-partisan. I do generally go with the point of view, how can you tell if a politician's lying? Their lips are moving. That this has become an aspect of, I'd better say the right thing so that I get the votes, rather than we would love to see honesty and integrity and transparency in politics, but it it means you won't get power if you do these things. So we seem to have come to a terrible juncture, it seems to me.
I mean, I think that that's one reason why Trump became popular,
Mm,
because he would just say anything, and people thought because he just said anything that he must be telling the truth,
mm,
because he doesn't care what he says or what it sounds like.
mm,
But he was the product of 40 years of right-wing radio, and so all these people were also primed to hear what he was saying and to think he was the messiah of sorts.
mm.
But that's, I think, people mistake, like, they think that authenticity, first of all, is it means that you're capable of being a ruler and being in charge, and that's really not always true. I mean, you do want a politician who is authentic, but just because they're authentic doesn't mean that they know how to rule.
Genghis
Oh.
Khan, I think, was tremendously authentic.
And so and in some ways, Trump is authentically Trump, even though he lies, but that's really him. He can't not lie. Now, I'm from New York City, so I remember those days where we would. I don't know if I should admit this or not, but we would go to Studio 54, me and, like, because we went to Pratt, so I had a bunch of gay boyfriends, and we'd have fun, and we'd see like Donald Trump there, and we just spotted him, like, we just thought, what a phony. Like, how could people be impressed with him? We'd like make fun of him behind his back. He didn't know. So it wasn't mean or anything like that. He wouldn't care. But anyway, I don't know where I was going with all that, but yeah, about the politicians, and the authenticity, and how that's what they saw in Trump. Like, oh, he's got to be good because he's not a politician. He's not lying. He's authentic, and they
Yeah,
got.
and he
And his
has locker room talk, and he's quite open about his contempt for
Yeah.
women,
So
so
it's
we
like,
can trust
oh,
him.
okay, he does that, but he's going to be real.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I don't think I've really seen mentioned, and as I say, I watched a tremendous amount of documentary material about Donald Trump,
Oh,
but nobody mentioned Norman Vincent Peale during those conversations, and the idea that one of the significant cult leaders of the 20th century, one of the most influential cult leaders, a man who sold, it's reckoned, 2 million copies of The Power of Positive Thinking. That's who Fred Trump, went to worship with. So you have this really, and it's a doctrine that we find again and again and again. The Secret, the Law of Attraction, Christian Science, Scientology, places where you're told that the world is bent according to your will, that what comes to you is what you intend. Now, this is abject nonsense. Anybody who can think surely understands that you can't have this one little planet floating in the great infinite sea of space where 7.5 billion people are all having their wishes come true, positive and negative. That can't actually work. But people get hold of this because it's a nice, simple idea, like the idea, some of the ideas Hitler had about
yeah.
Jewish people all have lice. The lice are giving us disease, and 45% of medical doctors in the German-speaking world joined the Nazi Party. 45% of these highly educated people were willing to believe this nonsense.
45% joined what?
The Nazi Party.
Oh, the Nazi Party. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, look, Hitler was he was Trump on steroids in a way. It was all about emotion. And once emotion, I mean, he was emotional. And Germany had been beaten badly in World War I, and they were all pissed off about that. So they were susceptible. And here comes this guy who's acting angry. Maybe he really was angry, but this is what the right wing does. Like Fox, the pundits, they act angry.
Mm.
And so he was able to convince people because people were able to put away their rational thinking
Mm.
because he set their amygdala on fire. Um, but yeah, I was going to say something else about that, but I don't remember what it was. Yeah, anyway, yeah, so he was able to convince all those people. I was thinking primarily through his use of emotion
Mm.
and repetition and boiling things down to something simple. Did you know that when he met Goebbels, they kind of like fell in man love?
Something like, yeah.
Yeah, like they met and they felt all this kismet.
Mm.
Uh, and the two of them were fed off of each other and then just created this um, brainwashing uh, machine in a way.
Mm. And of course, in Germany at that time, the radio was the dominant
Yes,
medium. There's no TV. They
yes,
controlled cinema completely, and made lots of films, which people have forgotten about. It's not just
right.
Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will and Olympia. There are all the Ice Maiden movies and all of this kind of thing, promoting this culture which they saw as being a healthy culture. You said that Hitler was like Trump on steroids. In fact, both Trump and Hitler are amphetamine users. With Trump, it's Adderall, and with Hitler, it was Pervitin. Um, and in fact, a few days before he killed himself, Hitler threw his doctor out of the bunker because he realized that he'd become addicted to amphetamines and cocaine as a consequence of the medical treatment he was receiving. So we have somebody who's, in Hitler's case, who's really completely out of it.
Literally on steroids,
Yeah.
practically. Yeah,
So yeah, and I think that the principle of saturation, that if
saturate.
we tend to think that the mind is somehow encapsulated within the body, and I don't think that's entirely true. I think that whatever environment we are in is also a part of how we think and how we feel.
Yeah,
And if somebody can disturb our emotions, then our reasoning sinks down and we become, and you get that buzz, you get that adrenaline, you get that, and then the sense of community when there are a bunch of people all hating at the same time. That terrifying piece of film, Madison Square Gardens, I think 1938, where it's on YouTube, where the whole place is filled with brown shirts. Madison Square Gardens, we're not talking about Munich. We're
filled with
talking about American Nazis getting together. And you had the silver shirt movement, the brown shirt movement, and rejoicing in that sort of atavistic sense of community, that sort of animal, surrender to the mob, which carried people on to commit such horrible atrocities.
right. A lot of that was group thing,
Hmm.
and like you pointed out in your book, it's people's natural desire to want to be part of a group and to not be ostracized. You want to think like the group. You want to talk like the group. You want to belong to the group. And hence, if there's a leader of the group, you don't want to disagree with the leader of the group. You tend to minimize what your objection might be to an idea that the leader has. Groupthink is a very, very powerful thing. I mean, look at crowds, look at mass hysteria. What people will do in a crowd or a group is not the same as they might do individually, and there can be a type of euphoria with being with a group that you don't get. I know I've been to, a lot of Black Lives Matter demonstrations and different, the Women's March, and there is a kind of a euphoria and that you get, and there's also a strength that you feel and a power that you feel. You feel a camaraderie. So yeah, your thinking is different.
Very, very much so. Because whether Goebbels knew about Bernays, we do know that Mussolini gave a copy of The Mass Psychology of the Crowd by Gustave Le Bon to Hitler. We also know that Teddy Roosevelt had read this book and was so impressed by it that when he was visiting France, he actually made a detour to meet Le Bon. So this is one of the most influential textbooks of the 20th century. It's not as much read anymore, but and he Le Bon comes to a rather negative view of humanity, with which I don't agree. He was a genius. He was a remarkably perceptive man, but I think his conclusions are wrong. I think that as you showed with your dad, that it is possible for people to come out the other side of this and be better for the experience, be able to do something, which is why it's a terrible shame in our society that we have seen tremendous advances, wonderful advances, that we're a lot more tolerant in some ways, thankfully, than previous generations. And one of those parts of tolerance is that if people are diagnosed with a mental illness, we are, they don't become the court idiot to be, made fun of. There are those incredible Velasquez paintings of the men of pleasure, the cretins and the dwarfs of the court of King Philip, and so that's not what will happen, and people will have a certain sympathy for you if you say you have depression or something like that. But there is one group in society, and I'm a member of it, that don't get very much in the way of sympathy, and that is if you say I used to belong to a cult.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of cookie cutter view of what that means, and one is sort of ostracized because, and those presumptions that we're making when we put that stereotype forward are what we kind of think about what groups do and how people submit to the crowd. Now, I was in Scientology for 9 years. I never submitted to the crowd. I questioned everything I disagreed with. I was shouted at twice. I shouted back. I was never a live-in member. But I, have now talked with hundreds and hundreds of people who went through similar experiences and who did surrender their autonomy. They gave up the locus of control. And that doesn't have to be beaten into you. It can just be that you find yourself in that environment. In the Chinese brainwashing program, a part of it was if you were new to the program, then you'd be put in a room with 7 or 8 people who were just finishing. And their last job was to hurl abuse at you until such time as you started to break, at which point they'd be let out. So you have that penetrated Western culture. It's called the hot seat in some groups, but there are hundreds of groups that use this situation of sitting you down and having the whole room abuse you. Synanon, Charles Diederich, used this method with people. Werner Erhard in Est, the original.
Hazing in a college, in a fraternity.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, and which is something I wrote about in Opening Our Minds, and something that.
That's what I think of it.
Yeah, I remember getting into a discussion with a man. He was the head of public relations in Scientology. He's the man who announced Ron Hubbard's death, and he was on a master's degree in philosophy of mind when he was recruited in. And he took real exception to me suggesting that hazing was a bad idea. He thought it was a normal and proper thing to do to people, to humiliate them to this level where they would then, and it's a sort of primitive initiation. It echoes aspects of earlier human societies and different human societies, where I think the intention is that somewhere between the age of 12 and 14, males should be terrified and then shown that what they were terrified of is not scary. Now, the Apache, I think, used to use rattlesnake venom. And if you survived,
Scary.
then you would find things not as scary. The Cheyenne and the Lakota had their rituals, which would make you into a brave. They'd make you into a warrior so that you would be able to face death. You have the berserkers in the Viking tradition. All sorts of groups where this is happening, and I think there's a kind of remnant of it in horror movies in our society still. That you can be brave enough to watch whatever movie, and I think there's still it's atavistic that there's still some sort of demand for that in our society, and I think that our society feels that it's become effete, it's become weak, and so we then have a kind of libertarian, survivalist, sovereign citizen clique who are not, so there are some of us who are looking forward to a society with, hopefully without violence, a society without rape and rapine, that maybe we could evolve towards something like that. And then there are people who say, no, that's human nature. And, that gave us Hitler and the neo-Darwinian doctrine that it is the bullies who survive, this mistaken interpretation of the survival of the fittest, which was Spencer, not Darwin anyway, but that by fittest, it means those most fitted to survive. It doesn't mean the strongest or the nastiest. But for 12 years in Germany, the schools were pretty much run by the bullying kids. During the Cultural Revolution in China, students were executing their professors, and we've all felt like doing that at some time, but actually doing it, so giving this mob frenzy to people to then control them into doing something, which we certainly saw on January 6th. That any film footage of that terrible sequence of events that was set up there, that is craziness. Where the mob is, they're looking for Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence so that they can hang them. We're no longer dealing with reasoning and
the only thing they
justice.
didn't bring was their pitchforks.
Yeah, it's what happens next, isn't it? And it has happened so often in human society.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons back to the hazing that groups do that kind of thing is to not just teach the other person, but I think a lot of it is disguised like elevation of the group.
Mm.
The group feels like they're even more exclusive, more special. We can do this to you, and then you are going to look at us like we're that much more special. So I think a lot of it has to do with that. But yeah, you were saying also in your book that you felt like the cure for this was education. And I do think that understanding the human mind and how it works, and that we're susceptible to emotion. We have something called the amygdala. We have, groupthink. Um, um, I think if if we're taught about things like that, we can be more aware. Like, oh, I'm I'm not I'm reacting emotionally to this
Mm.
right now. But just like when you get angry and you're too angry, you know, like me, I'll write something out, right? And I write the worst thing, and then I think, okay, I'll wait till the next day.
Mm.
The emotion goes, and then you write it with a little bit more clarity and take the anger out of it, and then you
Mm.
say it starts out this big, right? Then it ends up like, whoa, what's really valid is this. Do
Mm.
you know what I mean?
I do. I do.
Yeah.
If I feel affronted by something, I try and take 3 days digest it before responding to it, because otherwise I might get nasty.
I know. I think 3 days is better than overnight.
Well, it's you count to 10. That's the first one, isn't it? So it's 10 seconds. But sometimes with comments on my YouTube channel that it is very tempting to dish back to people the sort of things they're saying. And over the weekend, we posted a video about Charles Manson, because what is not generally known is that Charles Manson was deeply involved with Scientology. He spent 14 months receiving, while in McNeil Island Penitentiary, he had 14 months during which he received 150 hours of Scientology so-called counseling from a fellow inmate. He also read every Scientology book he could get his hands on. And I didn't, it's not, I've written about this more than 30 years ago. I wrote about it. But since then, a couple of books have been written about Manson. I'm going, well, why aren't they talking about this? And it came up that one of these books, which is called Chaos by a man called Tom O'Neill, I was on Eric Hunley's show, and I'm very deliberately on Eric Hunley's show. He's a libertarian. He's a Trump supporter. And I want to be able to talk to somebody intelligent who has come to that point of view. And Eric is intelligent. So, but we'd done a show, and afterwards he said, did you know that your friend Jolly West programmed Charles Manson? And I'm sort of, did I know what? Oh yeah, there's this book about it. So I realized I'd bought this book when it came out 4 or 5 years ago. And I'd looked in the index for Scientology. It didn't mention it. I didn't read the book. It's like, if he doesn't know about that, then his 20 years of research is not enough. So now I picked it up and found, 80 pages attacking my late friend, Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who was head of neuropsychiatry and biobehavior at UCLA Med School. And he was not, we weren't close, but I met him 4 times over the years. We spent hours talking. And he was a friend of Martin Luther King. He was involved in civil rights marches. He was an outspoken opponent of the death penalty. And he first criticized Ron Hubbard in 1952, and he never stopped till the day he died 47 years later or something. And he even addressed the American Psychiatric Association, which heaped awards upon him, saying Scientology is a cult and its leader is a crank. And, I am not intimidated. They kept suing him. So I'm sort of going, you're telling me that this man was a psychopath. You're telling me that he was a predator, and that if he had indeed programmed Charles Manson, and O'Neill admits that he can't even prove they ever met, then it would have been 2.5 years from a point where they'd both been in Haight-Ashbury in the spring of 1967 through to the killings in July and August of 69. And there's no record of them meet. So we did a show with Eric and basically said, look, there's no evidence for this. We should be very careful to accuse people of such a dreadful crime without having evidence. And Eric said, oh, Tom O'Neill's now writing a book about Jolly West. And some of the comments were really interesting. There's somebody telling me that I had confirmation bias and I was in denial about Jolly West's real behavior. And it was quite tempting to respond in an angry fashion rather than saying, no, there's no evidence. He's innocent until proven guilty. And I'm taking that position. If you have evidence, please, bring it forward. But it's very interesting. My assistant, Spike, called me up over the weekend, having seen that I'd put this comment up, and told me what a class act I am that I'd managed to respond to somebody in this way. And it is stopping and counting to 10 and going, this is a fellow human being. And yes, they're throwing rocks at me, but it's up to me whether I dodge the rocks or get in the way and start throwing them back. And what I've generally found is, perhaps 9 times out of 10, if you talk with somebody who's feeling oppositional and you don't megaphone them, and give it back to them, that you can get into a conversation. And if you can get into a conversation, you can arrive at some sort of consensus, which I can't see any other way forward for our species. We're going to destroy the planet if we, for human habitation, if we don't start collaborating and actually understanding that we could like one another. We could get on with one another.
Yeah. I think, when I commend you for, looking to speak to people. We need more to these people. We need more people like you to be able to do that. Um, I've tried. I'm not very good at it. But I have some friends from this group, Hear Yourself Think, that are able to do that in really an incredible way. They live in Pennsylvania, and they actually go to these crowds that are standing in line, maybe for like, let's say Alex Jones or something like that. And they'll
Mm,
just talk to people, but they start out finding s- common ground,
mm,
and then that lowers that like deactivates the amygdala, and they find
mm,
camaraderie about something,
mm.
and then they start with like Socratic questioning. So, like, what do you think about this, and how did you arrive at that? But um, not everybody can do that. But that's why we rely on people like you to be able to do that.
And yeah, and the thing is that you have done it. That you've made this remarkable documentary, which shows the process and explains what's happened, and it's for all of us. I do it now through this little YouTube channel and by publishing the occasional book. I'm working and have been working for a year or two on a book about belief, because I think that's the bedrock, that we have to understand how we've come to believe and how we do come to believe. And I think there's a fundamental principle. William James, in The Varieties of Religious Experience, talks about what he calls noesis, the feeling of knowing, the sense of certainty. And we all do it. The example I always give, I was 17 and a Bible basher was trying to convert me. And we ended up having a 2-hour conversation on the street. And I quoted enough of the gospel at him that he backed away from me, terrified, making sure I wouldn't leap on his back and tear him to pieces. I suppose I thought it had been a very convivial conversation. He was obviously of a different mind. And he looked at me, and his parting comment was, "I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true." And that's that sense of certainty, those feelings of knowing. And when we examine what we feel sure of, then often there isn't, in fact, evidence, proving that Jolly West ever even met Charles Manson before accusing him of programming him, without actually, and I'm sorry about this, I'm sure Tom O'Neill's never going to forgive me, but he doesn't show how Manson was programmed. He doesn't give us the slightest suggestion. He just tells us that he used LSD. And but hang on, if we're talking about MK Ultra and LSD, they found that it's a drug you can't use to program people. It's a drug you can use to confuse people, but people's minds tend to change when they take hallucinogen. What the Manson family were actually taking was datura, which is not mentioned in
What,
either of the two books that I've recently read.
what's it
Manson
called?
mentions it, and Tex Watson, who went to prison because while he committed the Tate murders, he was out of his head on datura, which is a quite different drug.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, and it's amazing because it's not illegal.
It's not,
And yet, in the 1890s, the British India Hemp Drug Commission, which I think is still the largest exploration of drugs known, 10,000 people were interviewed, and they concluded that cannabis should remain legal in India. They could find no harm. That alcohol should remain illegal in India because it was dangerous, and that datura should be extirpated, pulled up by the roots. And it grows all over the world. It's sold as an ornamental flower, brugmansia, one of the forms of it. And if you so much as smoke a leaf of it, it can put you in hospital. And I found an ethnobotanist the other week. It was just by chance. I remembered I'd met this guy 30 years ago and still had a mutual friend. And so I asked for an email address, and this wonderful man came straight back to me and gave me a page of description about datura and what it does. And it basically puts you into another world. It doesn't just distort the world around you as psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD do. It puts you into the nightmare. The idea of writing about the Manson family without talking about them being out of their heads on this dreadful substance, and instead pointing the finger at somebody else, I can't get my head around it, that something so strange would happen. But that too says something, because so many people in the comments, having heard what I got to say, and I read out, there are, I think, 5 places in his book where O'Neill says, I couldn't prove anything. This is all speculation. I could be overthinking. He doesn't give us one single shred of evidence, really. He gives speculation. He accuses him in an interview of having been the architect of MKUltra, that all 149 projects of the CIA's mind control program come from Charlie West. And then this is because he exchanged letters with Sidney Gottlieb, who did head the program, but he didn't know. There's no evidence that he knew that the man who called himself Sherman Gifford was actually Sidney Gottlieb. So we get this web of speculation and then the willingness to believe. And as you say, if we can teach people about confirmation bias, about the fundamental attribution error that we tend to magnify what other people are doing and diminish what we ourselves are doing. If you're late for a meeting, it's because you're trying to spite me. If I'm late, it's because there was a traffic jam. That these normal human ways of behaving, by understanding them and by understanding, you mentioned the mechanism of agreement, where if you want to talk to somebody, you find common ground. Well, that works. And it's used very deliberately by Mooney recruiters, Scientology recruiters, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. I've got in my book, I use the Al-Qaeda list. It's used by hostage negotiators. And it's used because, of course, it's the beginning of a conversation that you want to have rapport. You want to be there with the person. And you can do that because you want to help the person genuinely. Or you can do it because you want to manipulate the person. Charlie Manson's other favorite work was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Really?
And yep. I think Carnegie was totally genuine. I think it's a very interesting book, but there's a problem with it, because you're either naturally like Dale Carnegie, who I think, and I could be wrong, but I think he was a good man. And I think he was talking about how he related to people. But if you don't have that personality, then reading the book isn't going to give you that personality, but it is going to teach you how to pretend that personality and get into the business of selling secondhand cars or religions or guns or anything.
But I pretend to have that personality. Cary Grant said something very interesting about that. He said, I pretended to be me until I became me. And I remember with myself in my early 20s thinking, who do I want to be? I don't want to just happen, have things happen to me, and then I want to be intentional about who I am, and I want to develop certain characteristics and qualities. So that just made me wonder. You can't change the core of who you are, or how your body responds to certain stimuli. You'll always have that. But don't you think you can affect the personality somewhat, if with a focus, and then you practice and you decide who you want to be? Do you think that's, possible?
Absolutely, I do. Eric Fromm puts forward the point of view that we're born with a temperament and we develop character. That's the way
Yeah,
he puts it. Um, Aaron Beck
way to put it.
with his
That would be a good way to put it.
yeah, and with any luck, and sometimes it can go the wrong way. Um, Aaron Beck, the whole foundation of his cognitive therapy is that by understanding how we're interpreting the world, by listening to what we're saying to ourselves, which we usually say so quickly we don't notice it, that we can then look at our behavior and decide how to behave. That goes a stage further with, say, Martin Seligman's work. And I'm not a big fan of Seligman, I must say, but he's basically, his work on happiness um, has the idea. His young daughter complained that he was a miserable person, and he decided he had to transform himself. And so he learned the cognitive behavioral route, which is that you pretend to be something so you can be something. But it's a matter of who you're pretending to. If you are, and I absolutely agree with you, we should estimate our own behavior and think about how we would like to behave. So I think a lot of what happens when people become trapped in authoritarian cults is that they've projected all of the positive behaviors they would like to have onto the leader of the group without realizing that the leader of the group is usually a much worse person than they are.
Yeah.
And for me, when I left Scientology, I was aware of that in Scientology. Within a year or so, I was going, well, I'm treating Ron Hubbard as a hero. There's something interesting there. What to me would be the heroic qualities? And I left Scientology utterly and thoroughly when I realized that he represented the opposite of the qualities that I believe are valuable. I believe compassion is fundamentally valuable. And he was a man who didn't care about anybody but himself. When his own son committed suicide, he said, well, that's going to get us into a public relations mess.
Oh my God.
How selfish can you get? So, yes, so the point is, yes, by looking at Carnegie, somebody could, a good person could look at that and say, oh, if I behave in this way, then that'll make life better. But it also is a blueprint for sociopaths to find out how they should appear. So, I absolutely accept your point.
Right. Yeah.
And bringing people to say, if we got kids to just sit down and say, what are qualities? What do you regard as good qualities in human beings? Is honesty really the best policy? I mean, I'm not a supporter of Jordan Peterson. I don't think he's the worst person in the world, but among his rules for happy living is a ridiculous idea: never tell a lie. Now, you've got Anne Frank in the loft and you're saving her life. Do you go down and tell the Gestapo she's there? Because if you never tell a lie, I'm afraid you have to do that. Incredible simplistic ideas, which are not thoroughly thought through, which, considering he used to be a Harvard professor, is really quite incredible. But there you go. He does have about 20 million followers, so and there we go.
That's a lot of followers.
Yeah, he's made a tremendous impact on the world, and I think it's because, and it's the Trump phenomenon too, the idea that we can't trust politicians. And so when a billionaire comes along and says, we need to get rid of the billionaires, we go, yes, we'll vote for you. We'll drain the swamp of billionaires, rather than...
It gives $1 trillion tax cut to billionaires.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at his whole career from, the Commodore Hotel onwards, it's just one scam after another. And he's held up as a great businessman. And it's like he's got a casino that's grossing more than any other, and he puts 2 more casinos to rival it in the same place. You're going, that's not really great sense. But then, of course, he didn't actually write the book about how brilliant he was.
Yeah, he's had 6 bankruptcies, which didn't come out. That was a failure of the media at the time.
It's fake news. It's alternative facts.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they fell down on their job. They were just too interested in this phenomenon, and it's like staring at a car accident or watching a horror show.
Hmm.
And this will entertain people. It's making us money, but we didn't serve the public in the best way. One of the things they could have said was, oh, this person who you think is this great businessman. I mean, there are people who still, I hear people say that they have no idea he had 6 bankruptcies.
No, and it is that sense of I will be steered by my emotional conviction. I will be steered by the belief that Stalin is really a good man who is doing the best he can, rather than a paranoid maniac. There's a wonderful film called The Inner Circle, Russian film, and it's about Stalin's projectionist.
Really?
And I recommended it to a friend who'd left the upper echelons of Scientology. And he came back and he said that, there are 2 things that everybody should see. They should read 1984 and they should watch The Inner Circle, because he said, the projectionist is there and he's watching Stalin make everybody dance, having getting the Politburo drunk every night and making fools of them. And he's going, what a great man. And then he's seeing that these people are being executed one after another. And he's going, what a great man. And it's so easy to get with the program and to stop thinking, to not be able to stand back anymore and go, hang on a minute, what's really happening here,
The other thing that I don't know if you mentioned it in your book or if I was just thinking about it, but was how people, once they believe in somebody, if they want to, like for instance with Trump, like give themselves over to that person, kind of abdicate responsibility of taking responsibility toward what they do. So it's almost like, well, if that person lies or that person does something wrong, and I follow them, I'm not really to blame because I'm following them, and that's who I'm following. And right or wrong, in a way, it's like, well, it's their fault. They're not taking responsibility because they decided this is my person. This is who I'm going to follow. I believe enough in them that I'm just going to believe and do whatever they say.
And at Nuremberg, of course, this principle was tried. Befehl ist Befehl. Orders are orders. When Goering quite accurately said, I didn't break the law at any point.
Right.
And it's like, yes, but the law was evil. And a friend of mine has been advising the US military, and they have taken on that not only should you not follow an illegal order, but you should not follow an immoral order. And this is a real transition where saying, yes, but if you did something that harms somebody, then that must be, that moral compass is important. You can't just hide behind the rules and say, and that bringing of responsibility to people. This is part of his doctrine, which he calls courageous followership. He also talks about intelligent disobedience. This is my friend Ari Chalaf. And the intelligent disobedience is such a brilliant idea. He said he was giving a lecture and somebody in the audience said, I have something that demonstrates what you're saying underneath this desk. And so I said, what are you talking about? And she brought out a guide dog and said, I'm training this guide dog. And the guide dog has to be trained in intelligent disobedience. If it's a blind person with a guide dog, the guide dog's got to be able to go, you're going to walk into something and stop you. So be disobedient. Why don't we teach our children this? Why are we teaching them obedience so thoroughly when we should be teaching them to reckon not with what does the boss want me to do, but what's the right thing to do? And I think, and it seems very far on in human civilization for this idea to be gradually emerging that we are all responsible for what we do, no matter what,
Yeah.
the president.
If your boss tells you do something, like jump, you're supposed to ask how high.
Yeah. I was very impressed. It was a forensic psychologist called Brian Tully, and he gave a talk this 30, 40 years ago now, where he talked about white-collar criminals. And he said almost every time when he came to interview somebody, they'd say, my boss asked me to backdate a contract for a day, and I did that. And then the boss came along and said, now do a little bit more. And you get the same thing in gangsters, that once you've done something, we can now hold this over you to make you do more. You are now under our control. And so that giving away, the increments of dissonance, the giving away our power over anything, we have to be careful. We have to be able to think twice, to step back from things and to talk about things. So, not signing contracts without having gone away and talked with our spouse about it is quite a good thing. My dad was a salesman, and he was a very intelligent man. And like your father, he spoke many languages. I think he ended up with 9 because he learned Russian at the end of his life. He's a very smart guy. But a salesman came around and sold him double glazing for all of the windows. And we had to sit down with him, this was many years ago, and say, this is a bad idea. And thankfully, we have what's called a cooling off period in this country where you can revoke a contract within 7 days of signing it. And it was interesting to see that, I call it the inertia principle. Robert Cialdini, who is far wiser than I, calls it consistency or commitment. It's the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad. Once we have elected to follow somebody, as you say, we'll keep doing it. And it's inertia. Once we've started moving in a certain direction, we just keep moving in that direction. And so teaching people that it's okay to stop, if the book you're reading is boring, you can put it down. You don't have to finish it unless you've got a term paper or something to do on it. But
yeah. It's like teaching consciousness. We need to be taught consciousness, how to be conscious, and how, and really kind of how to think. I think that, and then also we need media literature desperately in schools. How to interpret media, and how to tell when how to examine it, how to find sources, how to double check, with sources, how to check that you're not reacting or believing something because it hits you emotionally. All of this stuff, and how to balance a checkbook should be taught.
And instead we have this sort of 19th century idea of geography, history, math, English, these, as if these subjects were somehow separate from each other. And we've lost, it used to be in the curriculum, it went out of the curriculum in the UK in the 1950s because Latin used to be taught. And that meant that people had to read Cicero. And that meant they encountered rhetoric, the idea of analyzing, evaluating, and articulating ideas. There's none of it left. But I do hope sometime before I die to actually finish a course for kids, because I think that's the important thing. I worked for many years on people's recovery from coercive control, exploitative persuasion. And it can take years for people to get back what they've lost. It takes a few hours to show somebody the basic methods that are employed by by groups to recruit people and to maintain their membership. And yet our educational system has almost none of this. And it's fascinating material. I had the great privilege of talking to some senior high school students in Oregon about a month ago. And to my delight, the guy teaching, this wonderful guy, got hold of me the next day and he said, I've never seen students so compelled. This subject matter is so incredible, that what we're dealing with. It's like, and that's what education should be. It should be something where you want to leap out of bed in the morning and go to school because it's such an exciting place. And for some reason, that's certainly not the response I had to school. It's grim and dismal.
Yeah, the first class that I took where I was really excited in high school to go to that class and to learn more was sociology.
Mm.
That was like, yeah, this is kind of the stuff that I think about. This is a good class.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I learned about hypothesis and proof and the kind of data that you really need before you can actually prove a hypothesis.
Mm.
That's like important stuff to know. That helps you discern the truth too.
It's vital.
People did a study. Okay, they studied 5 people and they came up with the conclusion that blondes indeed have more fun.
Mm.
Well, all 5 people were blondes, or 5 people. How where were they from? All from the same block, whatever. It doesn't count. That is discounted. So that to me, that was like the best class that I took in high school. Besides art.
And it's pretty much the area that we've both found ourselves working in helping people to look at social formations and understand how these things happen. Well, we should really wind things up because
it's about time, I guess.
It'd be very easy to just sit here and talk for the next 5 or 6 hours. But what I'd like to do is I've actually ordered a print copy of your book because I hate ebooks. And when I've read that, I'd like to come back to you and talk about that, if that's all right.
Okay, I'd be really curious what you think of it.
Yeah.
I really go into the conspiracy. I shouldn't be calling it a conspiracy because that'll turn people off. But there are theories, and then there are real conspiracies, and this is one that everybody should know about. But there's also the psychology and the tactics. So I'd be very curious what you thought about my breakdown of tactics. And I was actually I brought up your book and I copied certain segments of it into a document, and then I brought up my tactics sheet, and I'm like kind of like like crossing them, like, oh, this is related to that, and this is related to that. So yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah, we'll get into that at our next meeting. That'd be fantastic. And thank you so much for taking the time. It's a wonderful documentary. It's on YouTube, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And are you all right with it being on YouTube, or did somebody steal it from you?
Actually, when I found first, people were telling me, hey, your documentary's on YouTube. My producer, Adam Rakoff, and we were writing to YouTube saying, take it down. Then finally we wrote to our aggregator, which was Gravitas, and they're the ones that distribute it on certain streaming platforms. And they said, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you, we have a deal with YouTube, and they pay, whatever, 7 cents or whatever it is, so it's cool. But it's strange that they even changed the name, like brainwashing. They made it two separate words. I don't know if you noticed that.
No, that's
changed the title a wee tad.
It's appalling. Things that people do. So I absolutely recommend the documentary. People can go and view it. You don't even have to pay the 7 cents. The advertisers pay that. And very important to understand that it isn't just some kind of Machiavellian Svengali process that's going on here. This is how we behave normally. And that's what I came to as a conclusion, that there are ways of amplifying that and, pushing people along, isolating people, all of this sort of stuff. But we are being tremendously influenced by whatever information we're surrounded by. And if our news sources are deceptive and slanted, and there will always be a biased news, that's inevitable. But if we are being presented only with alternative facts, or lies as they're also known, then we'll start believing. So thank you very much, Jen. It's been a wonderful experience meeting you and talking with you, and I look forward to doing the same again soon.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it very much. This was fun.
It was grand. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.